Welcome back, folks. This is the second part of a great big long series of lectures. This is the second part on, some of our modern ideas about what wisdom is. We're talking about wisdom and how important it is in relation to creativity, human creativity. Anyway, in his book, The Decline of Wisdom, Gabriel Marcel, an early French existentialist philosopher, reflects on his experiences of horror and anxiety while wandering through the ruins of inner Vienna in 1946. What bothered him most was not the physical destruction of so many irreplaceable monuments of an honorable past, but the state of mind from which that destruction is inseparable, one from which all feelings of gratitude and veneration for the reality that those monuments themselves stood in honor of had been obliterated. He recounts a similar experience related to him by a friend in a town in Burgundy who was told by an American officer, "You should be grateful to us for bombing all this old stuff. Now you can have a clean new town." Unquote. These experiences left Marcel with the sense that our modern attitudes and understanding are peculiarly opposed to wisdom, and coeval, in fact, with its decline. The physical destruction wrought upon Europe was, for Marcel, but an expression of a more serious malaise, namely, our growing impatience with what tend increasingly to be regarded as obstacles to the advent of a new world, even of a renewed humanity. The impatience of which Marcel speaks here is rooted in a mass-scale civilizational rejection of something both ancient and universal, without recognition of which there can be no wisdom. Marcel's reflections on these experiences spur him to think deeply about the manner in which our ever-increasing base of knowledge and technological proficiencies has not only outstripped any wisdom we might have concerning the relative worth of these gains, but that these advances themselves and the joy we feel in exercising our great powers through them serve to cloud and distort our awareness of the importance of wisdom. The reason for this, Marcel writes, is that a man who has mastered one or more techniques tends in principle to distrust what is alien to those techniques. And he will usually be most unwilling to accept the idea that a meta-technical activity may also have value. The meta-technical activity that Marcel refers to here is reflection, which he calls a power at one remove. Marcel contends that the exercise of any sort of power should by rights always be accompanied by this power at one remove, in order that it might serve as a brake or a control against the abuse of power. However, our delight in the magnitude of the capabilities granted to us through modern technology and scientific advancement has made the imposition of such powers at one remove extremely unpalatable. Simply put, wisdom has always, in Marcel's view, acted as a counterweight to human pride or hubris. Where the counterweight to pride is lacking, the techniques left, as it were, to their own weight, are moreover burdened by the weight of pride in which no sense belongs to them, or which in no sense belongs to them, since, as Marcel points out, the techniques themselves have no intrinsic reality, but are only given a spacious reality through the vice of abstraction in the one who uses them, takes pleasure in them, and lastly becomes their slave. Without wisdom to guide us, our sense of our own abilities and powers is distorted and inflated. Paradoxically, we become slaves by overestimating our own worth and abilities. In the absence of wisdom, that is, when our awareness and recognition of the universal is debased and driven out, the place of wisdom is taken by a system of technical processes tightly fitted into one another, whose complexity is only rivaled by the poverty of the ends it serves. That's where you get all this teacher-proofing and people-proofing of everything, right? Robert J. Sternberg, more on him here. He says intelligence is not necessarily applied to a common good, but wisdom always is. He wants to counterpose these two terms. He has his own reasons for doing so. Let's see what they are. On intelligence tests, there may be better and worse answers in the sense of certain answers being more justifiable on logical or other grounds. But there are not answers that are wiser or less wise. The concept simply doesn't apply. Wisdom is neither taught in schools nor, in general, is it even discussed. Many people will not see the value of teaching something that shows no promise of raising conventional test scores. These scores, which formerly were predictors of more interesting criteria, have now become criteria or ends in themselves. Society has lost track of why they ever mattered in the first place, and they've engendered the same kind of mindless competition we see in people who relentlessly compare their economic achievements with those of others. Wisdom is much more difficult to develop than is the kind of achievement that can be developed and then readily tested via multiple choice tests. People who have gained influence and power in a society via one means are unlikely to want to either to give up that power or to see a new criteria established on which they do not rank as favorably. That works real well here in Alberta, fellas. I mean, it's just so true that the government just loves our big tests here because they prove that Alberta is the best in the world, next to Finland. So, why would they give up that regime, right? And, it's just an ego-stroking enterprise for us here. Yeehaw. Western education in the past couple of centuries has typically focused on imparting content knowledge and developing cognitive skills in students. Schools promote intelligent, but not necessarily wise, students. These students may have an admirable record in school, yet make poor judgments in their own lives and in the lives of others. So Sternberg, he's written a fair bit on wisdom. He's a psychologist. He's got this Teaching for Wisdom program. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because he's kind of a big shooter in the field of wisdom studies. Sternberg, what is this Teaching for Wisdom program? It's intended to facilitate the development of wise and critical thinking skills in middle school children through the infusion of these skills into a history curriculum based on a balanced theory of wisdom. In his view, wisdom involves balancing the interests of self with those of others, and therefore the consideration of multiple points of view, as well as establishing values. So here you go. Like, what is wisdom? Sternberg's trying to give you a kind of a definition of what wisdom is. It involves encouraging reflective thinking among students, or thinking about thinking, right? Otherwise known as metacognition. It stresses importance of teaching both dialogic thinking, complex problem solving that involves the consideration and balancing of several points of view, right? He wants dialogic thinking, as well as dialectical thinking, the integration of two opposite points of view, a thesis and an antithesis, to formulate a synthesis, right? He wants these things. This is part of wisdom for him. And in a curriculum, a Teaching for Wisdom program. And also, it has to be a history program, he says, primarily. It looks to historical events as case studies. Problem-based learning, right? Challenges students to figure out the implications of events. The idea is that by considering history, students will not be doomed to repeat it. There's that big one you always hear. And then Teaching for Wisdom is not accomplished through a didactic model of imparting information where I stand up like in my lecture right now going blah, 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 about wisdom and subsequently assessing students with multiple choice questions, but rather demands the active engagement of students in experiencing the various cognitive and affective processes that underlie wise decision making. So again, like a problem-based thing, right? You give them a situation out of history. Here's a problem. How would you solve it? How was it solved? How could you solve it better? That's ostensibly, Sternberg says that's how you make for wise chillins. Now, there's some presuppositions behind Sternberg's Teaching for Wisdom program. Number one, there's the assumption that wisdom can be taught, that wise thinking is a skill. I'm going to ask you, is it? Can it? And the second one is this assumption that wisdom is wholly practical, right? As an excellence in the practical sphere of doing, wisdom is often called prudence. However, Sternberg makes no mention at all of what is classically termed theoretical as opposed to practical wisdom or prudence. In ancient parlance, Sophia as opposed to Phronesis. An entire realm of investigation concerning the nature of wisdom and its role in education is overlooked here by old Sternberg, right? Phronesis, practical wisdom, wants to get at that. Sophia, we got no time for that. Let's not talk about that. Let's not discuss that. Mum's the word on that. Why the silence about Sophia anyway? His silence in this regard, it's not uncommon, by the way. It's everywhere. Like that, if you want to talk about wisdom from a modern perspective, they just leave Sophia out. That's what everybody does. His silence in this regard may have something to do with his demand that teaching for wisdom encourage students to establish or to create values. This use of the word value is a late 19th century invention, and it's diametrically opposed to ancient thought wherein human beings did not create or establish the value of such things, but rather discovered, saw, or recognized the essential nature of things through meditative attention and love directed at seeing the whole or the universal, as Marcel calls it, right? Often, this deeper realization of essence or being would be cultivated through contemplation or theoria, which is why Sophia is important, see? So it's partly in his language. The language that he uses almost makes it impossible to think about Sophia. You can't use the language of values and think about Sophia at the same time. And here's another person, interesting, thoughtful author, Patricia Arlin. Her thoughts on wisdom as the art of problem finding. Wisdom cannot be detected in student learning, she says, or cultivated in teaching practices that focus on finding the right answers, especially to the sorts of questions asked in intelligence testing. Right, so she's on board with Sternberg there. Wisdom is best sought out by asking good questions and looking for interesting and engaging problems. That sounds like a good class to be in, right? Arlin links the asking of questions to a more ancient sort of knowing, namely self-knowledge and a Socratic knowledge of one's own ignorance. I have some questions that arise from Arlin's thoughts on wisdom here. How difficult would it be for parents, government masters, administrators, students, teachers to accept Arlin's pedagogic challenge, particularly when they expect pat answers and high test scores? To what extent do parents not want philosophers, those who aren't wise but seek wisdom, but rather sophists, those who claim to be wise and also claim to be able to teach their children to become wise as the teachers, right? Do parents want philosophers or do they want sophists? Don't parents mostly want their child's teacher to be someone who will help him or her to be a successful speaker and doer? How many would actually be concerned with making their children into questioners, particularly if their questioning negatively affected future job prospects or worldly success? How willing are parents to acknowledge that education involves doubt and discomfort, and to affirm the importance of these experiences rather than blaming the teacher? Wouldn't pursuing wisdom in this fashion lead to the persecution of the philosopher? Second question. One can have aptitudes at finding problems and be naturally driven to ask good questions, but this doesn't mean that one is wise, does it? Nor does it mean that one necessarily even seeks after wisdom. So we still don't know what wisdom is, or what it means to be wise, even after reading Arlin here. Another group, the Max Planck Institute group, they've got this thing called the Berlin Paradigm of Wisdom. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It's one of these ones that's popular these days. So wisdom is defined as expert knowledge about the fundamental pragmatics of life. This is another way we think about wisdom today. The Berlin Paradigm of Wisdom attempts to apply quantitative, analytic, and statistical research methods to the questions concerning the nature of wisdom. These guys are a bunch of number crunchers, right? They want to understand what wisdom is by gathering or pooling data that details what people say about it. So, what do you think a wise person would be? What would a wise person do? Right? That sort of thing. They just opinion poll the shit out of that, grab the opinions and number crunch them, and then they quantify them. Opinion polling among experts on the nature of wisdom is then followed by interviews in which people are given scenarios that test their wisdom or savvy in saying or doing wise things. So you find out what so-called wise people would do, and then you score and you see what your wisdom score is based on how well you emulate or solve the problem that's given. Based on affirmation of value relativism, there's that word again, as an important meta-criterion for being wise, there's a plurality of wisdom, as it is constructed by humans for humans, and the idea that there is but one good life to which all humans aspire is acknowledged as utopian. Those ancients were a bunch of dummies, right? So I have some questions that I would launch at the Berlin Paradigm people. Their paradigm is not dialectically tested in the classical or philosophic sense, right? Which means that as a model for wisdom, it's not held to the rigors expected of one who truly engages in the pursuit of wisdom. Remember, what's dialectics? Remember back to that diagram I showed you with the two arrows, yellow arrows, one going up, one going down? Dialectics was related to noesis, right? That aspect of our thinking, that aspect of our cognitive life where we take something that we, like a definition of wisdom, and we take it up. We take it up and we measure it over against reality, right? This has not been done here. Expert knowledge. This is another thing. Wisdom is expert knowledge. Expert knowledge concerns particular objects of understanding. One can be, for instance, an expert carpenter or an expert shoemaker. Classically, the word wisdom was often used in this sense to indicate expert knowledge in a specific area of skill or study or endeavor. However, to suppose that the fundamental pragmatics of life are akin to such a specific area of inquiry in which it's possible to be an expert seems to be rather dubious. And then another thing, this one I've taken from another author, but it's the problem of the Apollonian syndrome. And I'm an English teacher, right? Maybe some of you guys are studying to be English teachers. Polonius, right? This character in Shakespeare, you remember him? What he was so full of what's the word I'm looking for? Lofty speech, right? He could spill platitudes. So let me just read to you. Simply put, what is the Polonius symbol? It's simply that a fool can learn to say all the things a wise man says, and to say them on the same occasions. Right? A fool and a wise man say the exact same thing on the exact same occasions. They can learn to do that. Consequently, when the interviews are being conducted, how do the interviewers know that the man or woman sitting before them isn't simply spilling platitudes like Polonius, right? When he's sending his son away, telling him, do this, don't do that, this is the best thing, take my good advice. But he's an idiot. In the play, Polonius is an idiot. And it's almost like when he gets stabbed by Hamlet, you're like, thanks, that was good. Even though it's bad for Hamlet, it's like, thank God that idiot's gone. So, here we have this problem of the Polonius syndrome. Can't the wise man and the fool say the same things on the same occasions. So what good's this little exercise in number crunching anyway? If we can't necessarily know that someone is wise based on what they say, well, what about based on what they do or accomplish in the world? Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich is an example of someone highly successful and skillful in the performance of his official duties until the end. Expert Ivan is cheerful, worldly, sociable, and clever. However, on his deathbed, he's filled with terminal self-doubt, tragically uncertain that his life was really a life worth living. Goethe's Faust offers us a similar example of somebody who has attained to all the world's knowledge, who has great success and acclaim, and yet who is interminably unhappy despite all of it. Can these people be happy? Can they be wise? Can we know wisdom by its effects? That's the big question here. The problem being isolated here with regard to understanding wisdom is, do we really know wisdom based on its effects? Is wisdom the same thing as its effects? Is it the case that a man like Polonius can say wise things and give off the effect of appearing wise, but in fact be a fool? And isn't it the case that a man like Ivan could act well and be successful by all outward measures, but inwardly be wretchedly unhappy? Hence not wise, right? A person might be creative in both words and deeds, right? And yet also be miserable or inspire misery in others. Wisdom is clearly needed here, but what is wisdom? What does it mean to be wise? So the Max Planck Institute group claim to ground their paradigm in Aristotle's notions about wisdom. However, their contention that value relativism is an essential meta-criterion for being wise is not amenable to Aristotle's conception of Sophia. In their view, any understanding of wisdom that is not relativistic is utopian. There is no summum bonum in the ancient sense, or in Marcel's sense of a universal that ought to be reverenced and held in esteem as the source and ground of Sophia, and as the common good towards which all human beings are by their nature designed to seek after in order to live a good life. Wisdom, in the view of the researchers, is a human construct, and the wise person is not the one who genuinely seeks beyond all opinions about wisdom for wisdom itself, but rather one who has the ability to define and select those goals and means that are socially acceptable and desirable in human development. It's like a technical matter, man. Wisdom becomes, on the grounds of value neutrality, the means of securing whatever ends are deemed culturally and socially acceptable. So we got to ask, is this truly the nature of wisdom? Is this the great unmitigated good for which we're seeking? Would such a wisdom be a trustworthy guide for our creativity? Wah, wah. John Kekes, another guy who's written a fair bit about wisdom, he actually pretty much says there's no such thing as Sophia anyway. So contrary to Sternberg, Kekes writes that wisdom can't be taught. The most a wise man can do in the way of teaching others is to remind them of the facts whose significance they should realize if they want wisdom. The realization, however, must be theirs. Kekes uses the traditional Aristotelian division between theoretical wisdom, or Sophia, and practical wisdom, or Phronesis, to talk about wisdom. However, having offered up these conceptions of wisdom for consideration, his next move is to reject them. He rejects them. Why? Well, Kekes dismisses Sophia because he refuses to accept the possibility of metaphysical knowledge, such as Marcel's articulation of his own experiences of being grounded in an awareness of a universal, or ancient accounts of experience of goodness and order and beauty being grounded in an awareness of God or the good itself, or the divine intellect or nous or whatever. In his view, human beings simply cannot and do not know of any truths that precede experience, referred to by Kekes as a priori knowledge. Kekes rejects Sophia on the grounds that it is an elitist idea of wisdom. It is the sole pursuit of philosophers and the possession of only a few. But for wisdom to have any relevance or great consequence in the world, it must not be an esoteric thing, but related rather more directly to the lives of everyday individuals in society as a possibility, not beyond their own capacities as human beings of ordinary intellect. So he thinks wisdom's snobby, right? Sophia is snobby. However, having rejected Aristotle's notion of Sophia, Kekes doesn't therefore embrace Aristotelian phronesis or practical wisdom. For although this sort of wisdom is, according to Kekes' explanation, widely available as a possibility for ordinary people, and so overcomes his second objection to Sophia, he doesn't see that being an effective actor and decision-maker will necessarily make one happy. Like the Ivan Ilyich example, right? Here's a guy who knows how to get shit done, and does it, and he's successful, but he's unhappy. I mean, how many people do you know like that, right? I mean, I get Kekes. So he's throwing out both of them. Contrary to Arlin, Kekes also dismisses what he calls Socratic wisdom of realizing one's own ignorance. He calls this form of wisdom negative. Here's a quote. The wisdom of Socrates consisted in realizing his own ignorance. Many of the early dialogues can be read as warnings of the harm involved in the failure to realize that one lacks metaphysical knowledge. Socrates, of course, did not claim to have it. He claimed, as I understand him, that the extent to which one has it is the extent to which he can live a good life. Unquote. So Kekes' rejection of Socratic wisdom concerning one's ignorance is premised upon the legitimacy of supposing that there are indeed such truths of which one might be ignorant. Kekes dismisses this claim, with the result that to believe that one is ignorant is itself ignorance of the fact that there are no metaphysical truths of which one might be ignorant. Kekes calls Socratic wisdom negative because he sees it as destroying any pretensions we might have about possessing knowledge of metaphysical truth while still holding us to account to find these will-o'-the-wisps. Thinks metaphysics is a load of crap. Okay, let's think a little bit about Kekes' dismissal of wisdom. We'll use the words originary experience, and we'll talk about that over against what he talks about as a priori truth. Sophia, by Kekes, is rejected due to its metaphysical presumptions and its grounding in a belief in a priori truth. That's what he says. Metaphysics is seen by him as a kind of disingenuous dogmatism, right? These crazy ideas, you're just going to believe them. There's no grounds or proof for them. You don't experience them. What are you talking about? It's nonsense, right? Kekes is correct to criticize metaphysics as a closed system of self-referential concepts having no grounds outside of himself. I think that's true, right? People studying philosophy have for a long time now attacked metaphysics for precisely this reason. However, it's important to realize that the language of metaphysics wasn't always so hypostasized and messed up. It wasn't always like this, folks. Rather, it began as the expression of what Eric Vogelin calls originary experiences that are still available to all human beings. Right? It wasn't just people talking about abstractions that aren't real. He's saying, no, the language of metaphysics was cooked up to talk about real experiences that we've had. And but somehow the connection between those experiences and the language is farted out over time, right? So people were compelled by such experiences to use metaphysical language in the first place. And the language of metaphysics only became dogmatic when it lost its experiential basis, resulting resulted in a mass of skeptical philosophy. Okay? So let me respond to Kekes here. His claim to seek wisdom while at the same time rejecting Sophia. The way out of this problem is to question the whole premise that the vocabulary of metaphysics must refer to concepts and is composed of a priori statements, that is, statements about things we know without experience of them. What if we're willing to recognize what Marcel saw while standing amidst the ruins of Vienna? What if we, as human beings, are able to have an originary experience that renders metaphysical language about the universal or God or some such epithet conceivable and meaningful? Moreover, if such originary experiences of metaphysical reality are available to all human beings, then Kekes' second reason for rejecting Sophia and philosophy as the pursuit of Sophia is also overcome, isn't it? The language of philosophy need not be understood as dogmatic metaphysics if it is encountered deeply and if the originary experiences that gave rise to it are evoked in the one attempting to philosophize. Given that speech that seeks after Sophia need not be conceived of as an elitist or specialist or expert vocabulary, but a genuine expression of human experiences available to everyone, certainly the pursuit of Sophia need not be considered to be the privilege of a few and the gifted, and strictly in the purview of professional philosophers. This is a load of shit. As Aristotle states in the beginning of his Metaphysics, by nature, all human beings, all, A-L-L, all human beings seek to know, not just philosophers. Everyone may philosophize. Sorry, Kekes. So, also thinking about wisdom as a mean. This is another thing that comes up in modern discussions. Aristotle spoke of moderation or sophrosyne and the rest of moral or ethical virtue as a mean, as being somewhere between two extremes. When we fail to hit this target or mean, we miss the mark or sin. Our actions slide in either direction towards vice. Scholar John Meacham applies this notion of virtue or goodness as a mean to aesthetic matters. In his view, beauty too is a mean. It is not the opposite to ugliness. Ugliness is an incongruity, a disorder, a jolt. But the sheer absence of incongruity and disorder is not beauty. Rather, beauty is what lies between the fatal extremes of mechanism and chaos, between too strict orderliness and sheer lack of order, between boredom on the one hand and confusion on the other. The idea of mean suits well, or of a mean suits well any situation where there can be something negative about the extremes of deficit and surplus, right? That's what a mean fits really well for, when you can have too much of something or too little of it. Indeed, the Greek saying pan metron ariston advises moderation is best in all things. Nonetheless, while thinking about moral virtue as a mean makes sense, Aristotle never applied the notion of the mean to intellectual virtues like wisdom. It's also significant that several times in various dialogues, Socrates asks his interlocutors if one ought to philosophize moderately, or if one ought to just love the shit out of wisdom, right? Does the pursuit of philosophy's ultimate object, the lovable itself, require a moderate and cautious non-lover who's always in control of himself? That's in the Phaedrus. Or does wisdom's pursuit not involve a divine sort of madness or mania? Again in the Phaedrus, right? It's madness. So here what I'm talking about is this idea of the Apollonian balance or harmony or order versus Dionysian ecstasy, right? These two gods in the Greek pantheon. Academics like Charles Hartshorne and John Meacham may be correct in one sense to say that beauty is a kind of mean or balance from an Apollonian perspective, i.e. concerning geometric middles and proportions, right? You look at old Greek architecture and you can see the concern for balance and the rest of it. I mean, I get that. I agree with them on that. However, it's simply not the case that beauty is a mean when we speak about Dionysian music or erotic philosophy. There's nothing middling about either the Dionysian or the erotic, dependent for their existence as they are upon mad transport and ecstatic movement. Not towards a moderated or middled beauty, but rather reaching out to the transcendent or sublime source of beauty, to beauty itself. The danger, then, in thinking about wisdom as a mean is that it doesn't consider the sublime nature of wisdom, nor does it truly account for the erotic nature of wisdom's pursuit. Look at Jimmy there. Look at John Coltrane. These guys are not middling men. They're mad. They're insane. Look at him. He's burning his friggin' guitar. Jeez. But if beauty isn't a mean, well, what about wisdom? Meacham and Hartshorne view wisdom as a kind of mean between knowing and doubting. Wisdom involves not necessarily knowing more than other people, but rather seeing clearly the limits of what you know. Here's a quote. Clearly two people or two persons can hold the same objective amount of knowledge, yet the first might feel that he or she knows a substantial proportion of all that can be known, whereas the second might feel that he or she knows relatively little. To be wise in one's actions is to avoid both of these extremes. All right. Similar to Marcel in this regard, at least, Meacham contends that wisdom operates as a kind of valuable brake on pride in our knowing here. It's an attitude taken by persons towards the beliefs, values, knowledge, information, abilities, and skills that are held. A tendency to doubt that these are necessarily true or valid, and to doubt that they are an exhaustive set of those things that could be known. But what does doubting have to do with wisdom? Right? This is a question I want to pose to you guys. In support of his view that wisdom is a mean between knowing and doubting, right? Wisdom is this mean between knowing something and doubting it. Meacham points out that knowing nothing at all certainly cannot be wisdom, but nor is supposing that you know everything, because you don't. Rather, wise people know what they know and what they don't know. Essentially following the old adage that the more one knows, the more one realizes the extent of what one does not know. Right? Meacham declares, "The challenge of wisdom is to avoid this easy course of merely acquiring more and more knowledge, and instead to strive simultaneously to construct new certainties, doubts, and questions about what might be known." Unquote. This statement brings us to a surprising and provocative contention in Meacham's article, namely, that the objective of knowing seems to be to doubt what you know. How's that work? We know in order to doubt? Scientific knowing versus the pursuit of wisdom. This is what I want to look at next. In Meacham's view, or it's Meacham's view that we know in order to doubt. This is closely associated with scientific inquiry. That is, scientific method always ought to admit that the facts, as we have gleaned them, are open to falsification, right? Openness to falsification is the only way to avoid both extremes of dogmatism and skepticism. Meacham argues neither extreme resembles wisdom, although the middle course between the two certainly does. So here's a question. Is the correct application of scientific method the same as pursuing wisdom? Isn't there a difference in what is sought as their respective objects? Now, in scientific inquiry, it makes sense that we seek to know in order that we may doubt what we know. Our knowledge in any scientific discipline or study is really just a means to more knowledge and trying to gain greater understanding, right? The knowledge that we seek through scientific inquiry is never a knowing that's intrinsically valuable for its own sake, but it's always a means towards some other good, like, for instance, happiness, say. So it stands to reason that our knowing in the realms of scientific investigation would be but a stepping stone to doubting. Right? It's always just a stepping stone to doubting. I think that makes sense. Is it correct? There's another question. Is it correct to suppose that scientific method and the principle of falsification apply to philosophizing? What about when the object of our knowing is ultimate, like Sophia? What about when we seek knowledge of that which is good in and of itself and for itself, not simply as a means to other goods, but as the ultimate good? And inasmuch as philosophy is the pursuit of such a great good, namely wisdom, can it truly be said that wisdom is a means between knowing, or a mean between knowing and doubting? Isn't doubting only a value where there's a higher good or a deeper truth yet to unfurl? Consider, if we abide in the contention that knowing is always a stepping stone to doubting, must we not abandon our search for wisdom or Sophia? Classically, seeking out wisdom means seeking out and maintaining hope for a truth that is absolute, whereas for Meacham, wisdom means that one is able to act with knowledge while simultaneously doubting. So, the primacy of doubt and the rejection of Sophia seem to be among the identifying characteristics of modern philosophy. This primacy of doubt and the rejection of Sophia. Remember these two things. When we're thinking today, in our day and age, in all the modern period, or whatever you want to call it, these are the things that characterize modern philosophy. Doubt's big, really, really big, and the rejection of what Sophia is. These two things are part of it. Whatever wisdom is, I guess. Wisdom decreases with age. This is a funny one. I'll read this to you. Contrary to popular sentiment about aging, right? We often think wisdom comes with age, right? Meacham writes that wisdom does not increase with age, but rather decreases. In his view, wisdom may be offered in popular culture as a consolation prize by the young to the old for the fact that they're old, and life is less pleasant for them. Meacham presents his arguments bravely. My hypothesis, he says, is that all people are wise to begin with as children, but that as we grow older, most people lose their wisdom. In his view, wisdom is a quality that is maintained and preserved by only a select few over the course of life. How is it that youth is the time of wisdom? Meacham begins by distinguishing between simple and profound wisdom. Contrary to the developmentalists like Jean Piaget, Meacham contends that children are already wise in a simple fashion, whereas with age, if such wisdom isn't forgotten through a loss of awareness concerning the limits of our knowing, wisdom may become profound. As we grow older, we become less wise because we become more confident in our knowing. That makes sense, right? I mean, when you get older, you figure you know everything. I mean, in a big way, right? You just, I know all this stuff. I've lived through that. Listen to me, right? Meacham writes that forces are at work from an early age that tempt us to lose our simple awareness of the limits of our knowing. He writes, in schools, a premium is placed upon absorbing as much information as possible rather than raising questions about and critically evaluating what is already known. How often does a teacher enter the classroom intending to challenge the student's beliefs, not merely so that false information might be replaced with presumably more valid information, but so that the students might leave the class feeling less confident about their knowledge and so more wise? Not too much. Instead, the emphasis is upon knowing rather than doubting. And so the easy course of movement is away from wisdom towards the extreme of believing that one knows all, or at least enough. However, Meacham does not appear willing to blame school practices alone for the loss of wisdom in our educational institutions. He recognizes larger social forces and expectations at work in the way we value, gain, honor, and success as adults. Meacham argues that a wisdom atmosphere is necessary for cultivation of wisdom, and that, in particular, it's essential that such an atmosphere be free from tragedy. Tragedy is thought to impede wisdom, which in his view requires an atmosphere of safety, wherein it is easy to avoid the extremes of too confident knowing and paralyzing doubt. I'd like to ask you the question, what role does tragedy play in the pursuit of wisdom? While there's certainly need for a wisdom atmosphere in schools, we might do well to question Meacham's rejection of tragedy, I think. On the surface, it seems reasonable enough. One does not want children to be afraid of or traumatized by school, after all. However, we might be suspicious of this rejection inasmuch as it seems to fly in the face of ancient traditions, in particular, the ancient conception of tragedy as articulated by the Greeks. In Greek thought, suffering is considered essential for the development of wisdom. The philosopher Eric Voegelin has written incisively about the manner in which tragedy was used as a vehicle for the cultivation of wisdom among the Greeks. He remarks that tragedy is a form of study of the human soul in the process of decision-making. The decisions illustrated in Greek tragedies concern matters of justice, and Voegelin points out that there is normally a discrepancy between the law, or themis, between what the law states as being just and what is ultimately just, or dike. It's then up to the solitary individual to reach deep down into the depths of his or her soul to render a decision that establishes dike. Now, the tragic decision-making process is described by Voegelin as a Dionysian descent into man, to the depth where dike is to be found. In his view, conduct only becomes tragic action when a man is forced into the recourse to dike. Only in that case is he faced with the dilemma expressed by the line to act or not to act. Now, all this doesn't suggest that what Meacham means by a tragedy-free wisdom atmosphere is the same as what the Greeks meant by tragedy. Indeed, the word tragedy, as we use it today, is often applied to horrible car accidents or murders or suicides, the death of a young person, or a catastrophic, unfathomable act of God. We use the word tragedy whenever some form of suffering offends our senses, or our sense of justice in the extreme. By contrast, in Greek understanding, all these nasty things, even put together, don't constitute the meaning of tragedy. Greek tragedy certainly entails the suffering of nasty things because, as Voegelin says, man must be forced into the recourse to dike by a dilemma. The suffering involved in the development of tragic wisdom is necessary. I'm going to repeat that. The suffering involved in the development of tragic wisdom is necessary. However, the insights of tragedy are by no means guaranteed by the occurrence of nasty events, nor simply by the need to make difficult decisions in and of themselves. Rather, tragic wisdom arises when the soul descends deep into its own depths through a Dionysian transport to find the order of dike, or divine justice therein. Tragic wisdom arises, according to Greek experience, from seeing, and therefore knowing, the ground of all order in the universe, right? Something happens that makes you see the big picture, the universal, right? That Marcel talks about, that he felt like he saw, and he was lamenting that nobody saw, and this is why they could blow all this stuff up, these wonderful buildings and all this culture in the Second World War, right? Given the possibility for this terrible yet profound wisdom, one wonders if Meacham's trade-off to establish a safe and tragedy-free atmosphere might be too little accommodating to genuine engagement with the depth of reality that the pursuit of wisdom demands. If one is made insulated and safe from the extremes of experience, and this is Meacham's project, for he seeks the median of wisdom, how much of the depths, let alone the heights, of inquiry and pursuit after wisdom is one really offered? If the word wisdom itself is not simply metaphysical jargon, but rather an expression of an originary experience of reality, how are students served by being insulated and protected from such experiences and seeing, and prevented from following her into whatever dark places she might be hiding? Is wisdom outmoded or obsolete? In the field of evolutionary hermeneutics, that's a crazy term, academics examine which ideas have staying power and which don't. Ideas with the most resilience through time are taken as the best ones. So whichever ones win, those must be the best. Whichever ones reside, whichever ones don't get dropped off, they must be true. Interesting. Authors like Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and Kevin Rathue, that's these guys, right? The evolutionary hermeneuticists, or hermeneutics, I guess, I don't know, point out the term wisdom has not traditionally designated knowing that concerns itself with the appearance of fleeting phenomena, but rather with enduring truths. However, they point out that in contemporary discussions on wisdom, as in contemporary discussions on almost any human way of knowing, one would seldom come across such integrated notions as universal truth or God. Today, such truths, in quotation marks, are held to be constructed as values springing from the minds and sentiments of human beings and societies. Modern sensibilities, therefore, seem at odds with ancient or medieval notions of wisdom. So again, what these guys do is they essentially say, well, those things fell away, so to hell with them, right? That's, wisdom isn't that. What is wisdom? Let's focus on what everybody agrees on. Moreover, they remark that the findings of modern psychology and the social sciences in general now can be seen as casting grave doubts on the ancient belief that the truth shall set you free. This just in, extra, the truth shall not set you free. Among the ancients, it was thought that knowledge of the good was enough to ensure good action and good behavior. It was thought that nobody knowingly chooses to do anything bad. We only act to achieve bad ends out of ignorance, thinking either that what we're doing is really good when it's in fact bad, or else ranking the good that we achieve by our actions as a higher good than it is in reality. This basic view is several times discussed in Plato's dialogues. It's also at the heart of Hindu Samkhya philosophy and its emphasis on liberating the self from suffering through insight. And again, it's present in Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy of emptiness, particularly in the conviction that by understanding clearly the nature of the self and of the entities to which it's related, one can attain Buddhahood. Modern thinkers, however, and for reasons already discussed, have generally rejected the notion of capital T truth, or language of God, or the universal, or the good itself, which articulate our originary experiences, right? And hence the meaning of Sophia. And yet, modern thinkers remain concerned with virtue as it relates to good action in the world, right? So they still want to be concerned with that. They just dropped all this other stuff. They therefore emphasize the development of a kind of practical wisdom based on the divorce of the ethical order from the divine order. Essentially, the role of Sophia is minimized or even eradicated in favor of a humanistic conception of phronesis. In their investigation of the outmoding of wisdom in modern times, the authors write that, in spite of overwhelming agreement of past thinkers that the pursuit of wisdom brings with it the most intense joy, this aspect of wisdom, or Sophia, is clearly the least emphasized and least understood in modern thought. Well, that's what I've been saying too. Indeed, they diagnose the reason for this dearth in our modern understanding of wisdom to be the result of the rejection of the possibility of theoria, or contemplative seeing that gazes at what is. They write, quote, "The general devaluation of a universal realm of truth or being that has closed the door, as it were, to the place of perfect joy or happiness. Such experiences would be discounted today as pure fantasy, and would the metaphysical realities that supposedly spark the experiences." So I guess there's a bunch of folks that you just can't talk to. The authors wonder about the loss, and like Marcel, they suggest that it's due to our modern fascination with technology, particularly the focus of attention it lends to the material rewards of its transformative or creative powers, and the profits that accrue from specialization and control. They contend that the result of our modern technological focus on transforming the world has been that the significance of pursuing wisdom has declined in popular esteem. Philosophy, or wisdom's pursuit, must be intrinsically motivated and detached from politics and business. The authors argue that wisdom must be pursued in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end. Wisdom, it seems, presupposes overcoming selfish ends. Part of the reason behind the modern rejection of Sophia is that the pursuit of Sophia seems to be elitist and socially irresponsible. Douglas Lawson articulates this accusation well in his book, Wisdom and Education, where he writes that any objective which leaves out a part of humanity is unworthy of being called education's ultimate objective. Citing the writings of John Dewey, Lawson sees our traditions of liberal education as having their root in an exclusionary as opposed to a democratically minded and socially responsible education. He writes here, "The ancient tradition, which thus associated liberal education with elevated social status, power, and leisure, has not wholly lost its place in the attitudes of men. The result may be seen in the well-worn pretense that all students who seek a liberal education do so for the sheer ecstasy of knowing." Listen to the scoffing in his voice there, right? He thinks, all this leisure is nonsense, it's elitist, snobbery, anti-democratic. And then he's saying, well, what, we go to school to actually enjoy knowing? Anyway, this is good old Dougie here. Lawson demands that education always be harnessed to the moral ethical commandment for the betterment of society. He views as deeply repugnant any education that is not supremely concerned with the practical matter of helping people to manage the material factors of life as work. Right? Your daily bread, that's what it's about, man. For John Dewey, education ought not to be associated with seeking out wisdom or Sophia, for such a search is premised upon the possibility of seeing what is, what the ancient Greeks authors referred to as theoria, or cultivating an awareness of our originary experiences of the final end, or telos, of all things. In his view, there is no such possibility of seeing what is, of theoria, of knowing the ultimate end of existence. It is for this reason that he speaks about all such reaching towards a telos as being akin to seeking after an imposed external end. Something people cooked up and forced down your throat, folks, right? In his dismissal of a telos, Dewey necessarily dismisses Sophia. And Sophia is just something somebody cooked up somewhere and is stuffing down your throat. As well as the necessity of creating a wisdom atmosphere in which the pursuit of Sophia might be actively encouraged. In his view, any aims sought in an educational context must be tentative and flexible, not telos-driven in the Platonic sense, but subject to change depending on circumstance, findings, and interest. Aims in education ought to therefore be contingent upon conditions. In Dewey's view, any aim is of value so far as it assists observation, choice, and planning, and carrying on activity from moment to moment and hour to hour. If it gets in the way of an individual's own common sense, it does harm. Well, common sense and philosophy, folks, they don't often necessarily meet. At this point, Dewey's hostility towards philosophy can be seen clearly, for philosophic inquiry often involves the philosopher in questions that run counter to common sense. Indeed, inasmuch as philosophy's ultimate concerns are not with the strictly or narrowly understood empirical, scientific, or social reality, but rather seek out a transcendent source for our thoughts about these matters, philosophic inquiry and questions will always appear ridiculous and contrary to common sense. Seeking out Sophia may, in the course of things, involve departures from common sense reasoning. So is Dewey correct about wisdom's pursuit? This is the question I want to ask you, because he's such a big figure in education and modern ideas about what wisdom is. Dewey frequently speaks about the vice of externally imposed ends in education. In his view, ancient attempts to cultivate the pursuit of Sophia through fostering a spiritual environment for the purposes of sharpening our awareness of the divine telos are essentially vicious in this regard. Dewey's criticisms resonate with the complaints we have discussed from other modern authors about Sophia as an abstract, trans-empirical reality or as unwarranted a priori assumptions divorced from experience. But what if Dewey has misjudged the pursuit of such a telos? What if Sophia and the love of Sophia, literally philosophia or philosophy, is not classically understood the pursuit of externally imposed ends, of hypostasized or reified a priori concepts or ideas? What counts as the end what counts as an end that is externally imposed, after all? Need the notion of a divine telos be understood and dismissed as such an externally imposed end? Or might it not be that such a divine telos, as was the case in the Dionysian experience of descent cultivated by Greek tragedy, is intimated internally as an originary experience? Like, where does he get off saying that every time we talk about such things, it's an external imposition of a telos cooked up? No, what if it comes from your heart? What if it comes from originary experience, an intimacy of theoretic gazing upon the beloved of what is? Like, what if it's that? How come he is so closed to that possibility? This drives me nuts, folks. Dewey's insistence that thinking always be grounded in experience is laudatory, right? Sure. Nonetheless, his emphasis on knowing as an outcome of activity bringing about certain changes in the environment suggests a limitation upon his willingness to engage in the full amplitude of our experiences of thinking. I mean, what? Is that the only way that we can engage in cognition, folks? Is by treating the world as an object that we go out there, like an I-it, right? Where, we engage in some activity that brings about changes, that we go out there and what we're doing is we're like putting our footprint on something, making a dent in it to figure out what's going to happen. Like, that is I-it. Do we, what about I-thou? What about the stuff we learned in this lecture series about Buber, right? Buber's ideas of the I-thou. Whereas reasoning or discursive thought necessarily involves change and fluctuation, analysis and synthesis, the contemplative activity of attempting to see what is, or theoria, i.e. pursuing wisdom, involves not the manipulation of manyness, but rather the experience of unity or oneness with its object. In fact, categories of subject and object disappear, where knowing becomes not a matter of manipulating an object to effect an environmental change in it, but rather participation in the other through union with it. Do you see? Dewey, he can't see what you and I can see here. He can't see what the vast tradition that he's shitting on can see so clearly. And it's longing to tell us, look at what you have left. Look at what you have left behind and scorned as nonsense. We have to wake up from this, folks. I think Dewey's great, but he has this serious, deep confusion in him.